So when we're talking about human performance, we could almost subdivide it. And do you have a opinion as to the importance of personality as compared with, say, a skill or an aptitude when it comes to peak performance in aviation?
Wow, great question. Even to this day, we screen for pilots for the military or for an airline or whatever, or be it for an astronaut in the Canadian Space Agency. They screen highly now for personality, and your personality and your adaptation to the culture and all these things are what will allow you to excel within that environment. If you're not willing to keep working hard, to keep learning, to keep your humility to a reasonable extent in the environment that you're in, it's tough to really get better. It really is.
And it just occurred to me while you were talking, we talked about the effect of having too many layers that don't really increase safety, but start to decrease efficiency. And it reminded me of an anecdote from a friend who was in the first roto of a Middle Eastern deployment on the Hornet, 6-pack of Hornets launched without actually having formal orders, and got them airborne along with the tanker packages that were heading across the ocean. They found that they were extremely flexible when they first arrived, and able to employ effectively, run a significant number of sorties with a very, very small team of highly, highly motivated people. But then over time, as the rotos grew, the wedge behind the front end grew and grew and grew and became a bit of a self-licking ice cream. And
the bureaucracy.
It became less effective, less efficient, harder to get things done, despite the fact that with all of the additional personnel and resources, it should have been easier. I just wonder if you have other examples of that in aviation throughout your career, whether it's on the military side or on the civvy side, and what are the markers where you see it start to happen, and you can steer the ship away from it before it gets there.
Boy, I'm trying very hard not to say fixed wing search and rescue in the military, which is a program I was involved in. I'll pause the sentence there and say, whenever I have been involved in a highly successful test program, flying program, something very challenging, it has been because the authority and the ability to get the result has been moved down to the lowest possible level.
Power to the edges.
You bet. Power to the edges. You really have to empower your people that are at the cold face, that are getting the job done. The more that power gets vacuumed up into higher levels of management or leadership or whatever you want to call it, depending on where you are, the more paralyzing it is to success. There is nothing gained by some general or some colonel poking way down into the weeds trying to control a flight test program or a operational implementation program, because they just aren't close enough to the problem. And the more you can trust your experts that are at the cold face, that are doing the job, you'll have way more success. It sort of comes back to that discussion earlier about the ejection seat. That was a colonel, that was a rare bird, pardon again the pun, but, and he and I just looked at each other, mano v mano, and I said, boss, trust us, we can do this. And he did. And it wasn't me, it was my team. I had some really talented folks that are still working in the same field today. But you have to allow that to happen. If you vacuum this up and create this bureaucracy behind the cold face, the gain, it's really just CYA, right? They're covering their asses. They want control because they're fearful of a negative outcome that might end up looking like it was their responsibility. But the reality is, when you're at that level, you can't control that many things. It's impossible to have control over all the programs, all the fleets, all the aircraft, all the pilots. You would be working 5,000 hours a day to try and do that. So the more that you can put the right people in the right place, in the right job, and empower them to do it and give them the authority, that's success.
actually kind of reminds me, and it's not an aviation anecdote, but the Hurricane Katrina response in New Orleans, where the government wanted to retain centralized control and ultimately slowed them down to a fault, whereas I think it was Walmart who was on the ground pushing power to the edges and just briefing their stores to say, do whatever you can, do what's right, communicate with us as best you can, make decisions on the ground. And I think it was Walmart that got water and their pharmacy supplies out the fastest.
You bet.
Completely irrelevant. But it also reminds me a little bit of, if you're a junior captain in the Air Force, the level of responsibility that you have as an aircraft commander of whatever it is that you're flying, whether it's single pilot high performance, you're on the road in the U.S. with 2, 3, 4 jets, or whether you're on an air mobility platform and you're the AC. Perhaps people don't realize, but you're also the dispatcher and you're the flight planner. And when the weather is poor and you're supposed to go to airport X, you're replanning to airport Y. And there's generally the faith entrusted that all of the training to that point, you can make the right decision and nobody's going to jump down into you're the mayor of Cockpit City. You're going to make the right choice. You're going to get to wherever you need to get to and make it safe. And occasionally you have to call back home to get a diplomatic clearance because you're flying over a different country and, get a new lift message cut from the KOC. But in general, it always surprised me how much latitude is given to, a 25, 26-year-old captain flying a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment.
Yeah,
probably to a country they've never been to before.
And I think you'll see the output of that is how well regarded our people are in their next careers. In the flight test construct, the most senior and talented pilots that I know from my flight test world are now, VP operations at Boeing, head at Cessna, head at Bombardier, and on and on. And this is in a multinational construct. These are Canadians that are out there that are leading in their fields. And I think it harkens back to exactly what you just said, which is that responsibility that we're given early on. And so it does work at times, for sure. I think culturally that's how it's been. I don't know that we're there today in the Canadian Forces. I think we've had a pretty big setback and experience, and with that also a power being vacuumed up the hill into the command levels, a paralysis by analysis and oversight that might produce a different pilot in the next generation. We'll see how it goes when we talk again, hopefully in 20 years. I'm still kicking. And we'll look at this again and see who's out there and how are we doing internationally, leading the way, or is there going to be an echo of this, current situation?
Those personalities that you mentioned, the Canadians that came up through our aviation system and are now leaders in the industry, the Chris Hatfields and the Billy Flynns and people like yourself, would probably also look back on training and simulation, which we mentioned earlier, and say the quality of the training was very, very good. That's what allowed them and yourself and other aviators to be safe and to be operationally effective, where perhaps other folks without that training in the same situation would not have been safe or effective. How would you explain the importance of safety and simulation in particular? You mentioned Air Canada simulation, so accurate in their simulators that the first time you actually fly is with passengers, to developing a safety mindset as well. So not just your procedural proficiency with the aircraft that you're flying, but the attitude that you have.
Yeah, I mean, the attitude comes from how you grew up through the system in learning to be a pilot, and also from the culture of the organization that you're in. We'll flavor that for sure. Simulation done right, I think, will always increase safety because we can simulate a lot of critical events. I just came through, wide body training at Air Canada onto a new platform, and the process, nose to tail, was about 3 months. And people say, how the heck does that take 3 months? How is it possible that you took 3 months to go through a training, and it's funny because if I was in the test world, it would have been 1 week, maybe 2. You would have read some books, you would have gone flying. But it's a totally different mission and a totally different safety construct. In the airline world, from a safety perspective, we have to have an organization with thousands of pilots. I have to be able to just reach into the bucket of names and pull 2 names out and say, you two are flying together. And the fact that we've never seen each other, don't know each other, we have to operate as effectively as 2 buddies who've done this for years together. So there is an enormous reliance on standard operating procedures. What is said, who says what when, how you operate, who's overseeing while somebody's pushing buttons, who's flying while somebody's talking. And that portion of the culture under the standard operating procedures is what drives the safety. Because they have a different challenge, right? If you're on a squadron with 12 pilots and you all know each other, you fly together all the time, there's a lot of inherent flexibility that you'll get because you're just familiar with each other. And you can possibly have a less stringent level of standard operating procedures and more flexibility. If you're on an airline and you're going to pick 2 names out of the hat, it's just not that way. And so simulation allows us to learn all those SOPs and how we're going to operate. And it also allows us to simulate failures that hopefully you won't see once in your career. The one that we talked about at length was, some kind of a critical failure over the ocean. We're mostly flying 2-engine jet aircraft now over the ocean. Back in the day, it was more often 4-engined aircraft. Now there's only a few of those left, the A380, the 340, the 747, there's a few of those around. But generally speaking, certainly at Air Canada, we're flying 2-engined aircraft across the ocean, which brings with it certain requirements, regulatory requirements for safety.
ETOPS.
Yes, we call it ETOPS. And you have to learn how that works. You have to learn, hey, if this happens, we're in the middle of the night, we're at 40,000 feet, and we're over the dark, stormy Atlantic Ocean, and we lose an engine, or we have an engine fire. What are we going to do in what order? What's the most important thing? What's the next most important thing? And we don't really have an overwhelming amount of time to have a debate in the cockpit, right? I mean, the captain's still the captain, the first officer supports, but you both will provide input to the solution that you come to, but you have to have thought about this ahead of time. And simulation is absolutely critical in allowing us to do some of those things. In the relative safety of you might spill your coffee in the sim. That's about all that will ever happen. But because you're so immersed in a very real environment, believe me, you'll sweat in the sim, and you'll think it's real. You'll forget that there's nobody back there. So that's what takes so long. Long answer to your short question, but that's what takes so long. That's what builds the safety culture. And it depends on the mission, right? In the airline mission, because of how we operate, it's a different scenario.
Do you have an opinion on Air Canada's reporting system as compared with the flight safety system, or any other flight safety reporting system with the other organizations you've flown with?
I think they've come full circle to be very similar. I think as we've gotten along in the years of flight safety being reported, it's become more practical. We have it on a tablet. You can populate your flight safety report in flight, and when you reconnect to Wi-Fi, it'll automatically send. So, pilots are lazy. We don't want to sit down after the flight and do a bunch of writing. If we can have a quiet moment at cruise when we're not the pilot flying, we have a few minutes, we can start writing out their flight safety report. So part of that culture is make it easy, because pilots are lazy. So, I say that tongue in cheek, but in reality, the easier that you can
Work
make
smarter,
the reporting,
not harder.
Yeah, the easier you can make the reporting structure, the better off you are, the more familiar it is. So in this app-driven world, we fly with iPads everywhere we go. In most of the modern aviation fields, even in fighters, they've got iPads. So, here we go. We got an iPad. We got an app. The culture is established in the organization for there to be no retribution for your report. And so you've set the table for the operator to feel absolutely confident about reporting. And I think that is the key. And I think that is pan-organizational to where I've been in the last 20 years even. You know, I think the National Research Council was one place that I've ended up being chief pilot at, where we had to work a little bit at creating that culture. They were a little bit behind in terms of understanding that there wasn't retribution. So we had to really create that culture still there, but I'd come from other places that had it. So it was easier to make it happen.
Do you get preventative measures pushed out through Air Canada channels? Do they aggregate the data, all the reports that are coming in, do their own analysis, and then if something meets the threshold of, hey, there's a preventative measure we should push out, they just push it to your iPads? Or
yeah, we get it via chief pilot notes. So each fleet has a chief pilot, and they do a great job of sometimes modifying the standard operating procedures. Sometimes there's a change to the flight operations manual that reflects a new reality that we need to consider. So the information flows back and forth for sure. It doesn't go into a void. It's analyzed. I mean, we even have what we call gatekeepers that monitor the flight data of all flights. And if there's an excursion of some sort in terms of configuration or speed or bank angle or approach criteria or whatever, it's flagged automatically. It goes to the gatekeeper, they look at it, and they'll call the crew and say, hey, on this approach into airport X, Y, and Z, at this time, we saw that this happened. Can you tell us a little bit more about what was going on? So that's a case where perhaps the crew was unaware, which happens, right? You get busy and you didn't realize that you had, pushed beyond one limit or another in terms of the standard operating procedures. But it creates a short-term full circle to maybe they go, hey, we didn't report that, so let's report that. And so if it doesn't come to mind of the crew, it's another way of pushing the safety out and monitoring safety. So
yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't realize I had that capability. But I bet it keeps pilots flying that approach speed plus or minus a couple of knots and make sure they configure exactly on time and land on the 1,000-foot markers without any deviations.
And that's your friend, right? In modern aviation now, they're meeting every year, these international councils, be it ICAO or be it the European EASA folks or the FAA transport, and they're trying to establish a forward-looking hit list, if you will. What's the most important thing to us to try and make aviation safer? And we're talking about, the bigger airplanes here, over 7,000 some odd kilos up to into the airliner world, commercial aircraft operators. And there are things like, topically, runway incursions. So those who follow the news will have seen in Japan the 777 that unfortunately collided with the Coast Guard Dash airplane. That was a runway incursion, it seems. I mean, they're still analyzing the data, so I don't want to talk out of school too far. But regardless, you ended up having an aircraft landing on a runway that is occupied by another aircraft. And they collided, and very sadly, some lives were lost on board the Dash 8. But that's one of the 5 on the hit list. Like, we already know, looking forward, we're trying to solve runway incursions because we know how deadly they can be.
Deadliest crash in the world, Tenerife, was arguably...
2 747s in the fog, right? And runway excursions are the next one. Ironically, I think yesterday, a United, I think it was American Airlines feeder, anyways, a feeder airline in Rochester slid off of a runway in snowy conditions. So runway excursions, meaning you unintentionally leave the taxiway or the runway during a takeoff or a landing or maneuvering on the airfield. We already know that this is a really important issue to solve. And so forward-looking, some companies are bringing either policies in place or technologies into place to help us reduce the likelihood of things like that happening. So this is where the safety network now starts to move forward, right? Instead of just being a rearward-looking mirror, that doesn't help us in the future. Now it's like, okay, so we know this is on our top 5. What are we doing to help solve this problem? And so I'm encouraged by us identifying those things, how well we do it. School's out still. We just got to keep working hard at it.
being able to push it out rather than, as an operator, having to draw that information or try and find it from wherever. Does Air Canada coordinate with other airlines or with NASA through their ASRS to try and draw out lessons learned from other operators?
I don't know, because I'm not involved in the actual safety cell of the airline. I'm on the operator side. So what goes on behind those scenes and how they interface with other operators, I'm not sure. But I do know they attend conferences that are multidisciplinary and multi-airline. So I'm sure there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, but I'm just not the one to ask the question.
Well, it would be remiss if we didn't talk about, or I didn't ask you a war story question. Can you think of a time in your career with any of the organizations that you flew with where safety culture played a role in your decision-making in a challenging environment, in a challenging situation?
Yeah, for better or for worse, shall we say. If you go back to Gulf War I in Iraq, I was on 433 Squadron, and we were deployed to a red flag exercise in Nellis. And it was on the Thursday of the week that we were there that the fighting started. And we got a call from the general. And back then, Canada was, there was a division at 30 West, which is a longitude, where east of that was the European command. And a general over there was in charge of our forces, because we still had fighters in Europe back then. Because we're going back.
F5s in Germany?
No, these are F-18s.
We're talking Gulf War
90s. We're
past
talking the 90s, right?
Yeah, for sure.
We're talking the early 90s here. So we had F-18s in Europe, and they were under one commander. And everything to the west of that 30 West line was North America, and there was a different commander. So we were at 433 in Bagotville, Quebec. We were under that North American commander's command. The war starts, and they call us down in Nellis and go, boys, you're sending 6 airplanes, 6 pilots, and we want you there on Sunday. And we are in Nellis in the middle of an exercise in the sun, and it's Thursday. So this is where the operational imperative interfaced with safety. To try and turn that corner, we had to pack up, get the airplanes, first of all, back to Bagotville. Then we had to get our personal affairs somewhat in order, so including getting immunizations, getting wills drawn up, because we were not yet as much of a wartime Air Force, I think, as they are today. We weren't as triggered and ready to go. So there was a lot of work behind the scenes that had to happen. We had to get a tanker organized. We had to figure out ways to get across the ocean to try and get to the theater. Of course, the big war is on, you can't find a tanker, right? They're all in theater. They're busy. So now we have to figure out how to get across the ocean with a 6-pack of F-18s by hopping our way across World War II style, right? This is back to the Bomber Command, dragging Lancasters and Halifaxes across the ocean, or even fighters for that matter. And so what we would normally worry about, like crew rest, well, you can imagine how little sleep we got between the Thursday and the Sunday, right? We were all absolutely shattered. And when the weather in Bagotville turns into 125 in driving snow and minus I don't know how much, and it's time to go, well, we went. And we went to Sonderstrom, Greenland first, and that's where we got our gas. And
that's a whole other set of challenges flying into Greenland.
A whole other set of challenges. And then out of there to go to Iceland, and that's where we planned to overnight. Well, we're in Sonderstrom, and we come out to our airplanes after a long first hop, and 5 of the 6 are refueled and 1 is not. And we're wearing immersion suits and G suits, and we've got bags and helmets and publications. And I mean, it's an effort to get yourself strapped into the airplane. And it wasn't until we strapped in, got our APUs on, and got the radios going that we heard from one of the guys, hey, I don't have gas. So now you're sitting there, it's the middle of the night, you're absolutely shattered. And no kidding, we said, okay, well, the 5 out of the 5 of us that had gas said, well, I'm not going back inside. I'm going to sit here until you get gas. And I literally fell asleep in the airplane. And I woke up when the 6th guy got gas and started his airplane, and the APU went on. And I heard, brrr, it's like, oh, so that's where, safety versus operational imperative really got trimmed, right? The operational imperative was extremely high, perhaps not in small part due to our fighter pilot personalities and wanting to go, and make sure we help defend the Western priorities. But there are times when like that was one classic where we really, safety got shaved way down and mission got exploded. And in retrospect, we look at it now and go, what were we thinking? We should have taken more time.
That's wild. I mean, it's non-trivial flying into Greenland in the winter at the best of times, let alone when you're on min-crew rest. It's snowing, nighttime, and you're in a fighter as well, which is significantly less comfortable and higher workload for the approach than flying in on an RNAV arrival.
Yes.
That's wild. And then via Iceland, Shannon.
Yeah, absolutely. Shannon, and then into Baden, Zellingen back in the day, 4-wing. Yeah.
How long were you there for?
Well, back to that delineation of authority that we talked about earlier between the two generals. When we got there, the general from the 4-wing, CENTAF, I think it was called back then, or I can't remember the TAF, but he came to us and said, "Thanks for the airplane, guys. Have a good flight home." And we were like, "What do you mean, thanks for the airplane, have a good flight home?" And so then I guess the generals got into a discussion. There had been a misunderstanding. So they arm wrestled, I guess. And in the end, he came back and said, "Listen, you guys have a choice. You can go back home, give us the airplanes, we'll take them into the theater," because we had 433 Squadron was the last squadron formed. So we had the latest model of the airplane. Not that they were different, but they were just really good airplanes. They were super serviceable, pristine, low hours, and they wanted those airplanes in theater. And so they gave us a choice that you can go back home, get your affairs really sorted out, and come back in 3 weeks to go into theater, or you can go now. And so being team-oriented, as you are on a squadron, we said, no, you know what, we'd rather come back with our whole squadron, we'll come back in 3 weeks. And those of us who know our history know that 3 weeks is all it took, and it was over. And fortunately, I think for everyone, that was the end of that the air campaign, and we never did go. But it was quite an interesting time.
Okay. Why don't we finish up with you explaining to the listeners and viewers what it was like as a commanding officer of a fighter squadron?
Boy, the pleasure of my life, to be honest. I had a fantastic squadron. I inherited it from Rich Foster, who's just a super leader, later to be a 3-star general. I should have commanded the Air Force, in my opinion. And so the squadron was in great working order when I got it, which is either an opportunity or not. It depends on how you look at it. I think if you're a commanding officer taking over a squadron and it comes to you in pretty much perfect condition, your first thought is, don't screw it up, right? But I got on some majors that were amongst the best people I've ever worked with. And, back to the philosophy of pushing the authority and responsibility down to the lowest common denominator. I know I tried to do that because that was what always ticked me off when I was in their shoes, was not getting that ability, that opportunity. So that's how I tried to lead the squadron. But let's be honest, when you have these super duper folks that are working with you on the squadron, that's what they're doing. They're working with you. Sure, in the military, there's a gradient, and you're the boss at the end of the day. I tried to just make sure that meant that I was the shit shield and that they could do their job. And so I was blessed with just a wonderful, wonderful crew. And so the experience front to back, the technicians that we had, the maintenance organization, intel, supply, they were just all fabulous. And all I tried to do was to make sure that we enabled folks to do their job the way they felt was the best way to do it, as long as it fell within our objectives. At the end of the day, when we left, the squadron unfortunately got closed. It was part of a restructuring of the Air Force, trying to find some positions. But in that last year, we had the highest flying rate of a fighter squadron in the Canadian Forces out of the 5 squadrons. We had the highest serviceability rate. And those don't go together, right? Necessarily. Like normally when you fly hard, you can't.
You break things.
You break things and they don't work well. But, I just had this inherent belief in the people, and rightly so. They were fantastic at what they were doing. And I can still remember, it's sort of it's funny how these small snippet of stories that stay with you over the years. But we had been blessed, you go and do a morning briefing with the maintenance staff and the pilots every morning before you start your day. Call it the ops briefing. And during that, they'll inform the commanding officer and his staff, what the status is of the squadron. How many airplanes do we have? The scheduler will say, here's what our plan is for the day. We're going to fly this many airplanes on 1 or 2 waves of launches, and this is what we're trying to achieve. And that's sort of set out in a weekly and a monthly objective. And we'd always had what we needed to do it. Maintenance always provided the airplanes. But we came in this one Monday morning, and the maintenance officer had this sheepish look on his face, and he comes up and he goes, listen, boss, we've only got 2 airplanes serviceable, and we just had a couple things go wrong, blah 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 blah. Some inspections came in or whatever it was, right? But this hadn't happened in 2 years. And he just goes, listen, we can give you 2. We can do a 2 turn 1. So you fly 2 in the morning, fly 1 in the afternoon, and my scheduler's pushing. I got to get these missions done because I want to upgrade this guy and I want to do this. And I kind of just looked at my squadron maintenance officer and I said, listen, how long do you need to get us 8 airplanes? And he came back and I should remember the number of days, but I think it was 2 or 3 days. He said, boss, I need like a couple or 3 days. I just looked at my training officer and said, all right, put on some ground school. We're giving the maintenance all the airplanes. And looked at him and says, you have one job, is to get us back on the pile. And that was, there was grumbling in the pilot community because they all love to fly, right? They're, you're leashing the dogs and they're not happy. But, it was one of those examples of trusting your maintenance organization that they're giving you the best they can. And that if you give an opportunity to recover from an unusual situation, that they will. And that really defined how we operated. It was really enabling the people to excel. And I had great people. So
I like a happy ending, Paul.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, let's wrap up there, and let me express my infinite gratitude for your time and for coming on board with Dicerra. I can't wait for the next conversation, and there will be another one. We'll have you back on the podcast again.
Right on. Well, I'm looking forward to pushing safety to a new level, and finding a way for us to even evolve further in the aviation field. Even we know the medical field needs a lot of help here, but even in the aviation field, like I said, keep learning, trying to get better, and that's what we hopefully will do.
Absolutely. Cheers, Paul.
Thanks again.
Thanks.